from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Featured today, K-State's Robin Reid and Lucas Haag, as they'll take on a leading topic in the many drought-riddled parts of Kansas right now, considerations on taking the prevent plant option for row crops under crop insurance coverage. Because of the dryness, they'll look at the agronomic factors to be weighed and will compare the economics of exercising this option to those of going ahead and planting the crop with the prospect of higher market prices later on. They'll also tell about a special K-State spreadsheet to help producers walk through this decision. Lucas and Robin will join us next. Further ahead, this week's commentary on life in rural Kansas from K-State's Gus van Der Hoeven, here on Agriculture Today. Welcome once more to another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. For the better part of today's broadcast, we're going to get into what is a prevalent question with a large number of producers around the state of Kansas, especially those who have had enduring drought conditions and leading to major questions about planting intentions and whether or not, as a matter of fact, a producer should go ahead with their planting plans for row crops or look at the alternative of claiming a prevented planting in their crop insurance. Joining us now, Robin Reid from the Department of Agricultural Economics at K-State and Lucas Haag, Northwest Kansas Research and Extension Crop Production Specialist, to tackle this. Lucas, we'd like you to set the table here and look at the agronomics and what's happening out there with our producers. You're receiving this question quite frequently now about whether or not to go ahead and seed that crop.
Sure thing, Eric. And so, we've got multiple things at play. And of course, one is always the question of, do we got enough moisture to actually get the crop up? But then there's the other question that's part of that. And as we start looking at some more of our longer term, where we're at from a precipitation standpoint, what's our profile water? What do we got? How much soil moisture do we have in the profile to move this crop along productively? And so, and even though we've had some rains across the state here the last couple of days, we had a system move through. We're supposed to get another one moving through tomorrow. But even after some of these significant rains in areas, I look across the state and folks can examine this for themselves, of course, at mesonet.kstate.edu. We can look at the departure in precipitation. And so, for example, at Colby, even after the rains we received earlier this week, over the last year, we're still running about not quite 5.5 inches below normal. We see, throughout, and especially southwest Kansas, if we look down into Morton, Stanton, Stevens counties, deficits in the 6 to 8 inch range in precipitation in the southwest part of the state. So certainly, that plays into that management decisions in terms of nitrogen rates, seeding rates, and we've had some of that in our e-update articles the past couple of months. But really, the more pressing issue has been, do we have enough moisture to get a stand, to actually get that crop established? And so, those are the issues that we're currently wrestling with.
And the reality of it is, and you mentioned, Lucas, recent rainfall, welcome, of course, but when you look at the severity of drought in so many pockets of Kansas and the larger part of western half of Kansas, it's going to take an enormous amount of rain just to get up to normal, which just isn't in the cards, is it?
No, it would be, it's going to take a long process for us to get out of this and maybe not specific to the prevent planting issue, but we think just longer term, we're looking at some wheat crop prospects that aren't that great in a big portion of the state, which means we don't raise very good stubble. And so in our dryland cropping systems, this kind of can become a downward spiral in terms of productivity, and it really takes an above average year to pull us out of that.
So then, and we'll bring Robin in here shortly, you are hearing from producers and wondering aloud to you whether or not to opt for that preventive planting versus planting?
Yeah, and Robin gets into this in her worksheet, but, there's a lot of other issues that play into this, and we compound that with, the high cost for fertilizer right now, the challenges and logistics of getting herbicides on hand. We've got some producers who really haven't done anything to their fields yet versus we've got other farmers who've got all their nitrogen down, maybe already have some of the residual down for row crop. So we've got a very, wide range of scenarios out there that folks are looking at, saying, okay, what if this becomes a sunk cost? How far can I go down this road to where I'm basically committed to a decision? And of course, we're sitting here, the first part of May. We've got a lot of time to plant corn, and certainly even longer time to plant sorghum yet. But the clock is ticking in terms of getting those decisions made.
Very much so. And let's bring Robin in, the co-author of this article on the very topic that's at agmanager.info. Robin, explain the prevent plant provision within crop insurance policies, how it works.
Sure, Eric. And, just to recognize this is an interesting scenario, because the last time I worked on prevent plant really widespread in Kansas was 2018, when we had flooding and we had all this rain. And so making a prevent plant decision in that scenario is different when you can't physically get out in the field to put the crop in. But when we're looking at prevent plant because of drought, it is more of a judgment call than a physically can we plant the crop, is of a should we plant the crop. So, what RMA says on this is if you want to do prevent plant, really what you're looking at is if there's not enough moisture in the soil for germination to occur. So that is kind of their textbook definition of when you should do it or not. Obviously, that's a judgment call as well. But if you decide that is the best route, and I'm going to talk about some things to help you make that decision, but basically you would have to provide your crop insurance agent evidence of that prolonged period of drought, and that it has to be general to the surrounding area that prevents other producers with similar acreage characteristics from planting as well. So that is something you need to really be talking to your crop insurance agent about now if you're considering doing prevent plant, making sure you understand all the documentation that needs to be made for that, because, in reality, as Lucas said, we have quite a bit of time yet before that final planting date, when we do have to notify that crop insurance agent if we're going to take prevent plant. So we could have some very timely rains coming in the next couple of weeks here that could change that situation some. As Lucas said, the soil profile still is very short, even if we do get some moisture in these next couple of weeks. But you do have to take into consideration, if we do get a bunch of moisture, can you put some of that crop in the last week before that planting deadline? So all of those things are things you need to be talking about with your crop insurance agent now.
You mentioned it briefly here, Robin, before we move any further. Evidence of the prolonged period of drought could be such information as found on the Mesonet website out of K-State. Would that suffice?
Yeah, so that is something that could be used. You can go onto the U.S. Drought Monitor and see the entire map of Kansas. I did include that on the paper here, but there's a lot of counties that are in D3 and D4 drought, which is the most severe categories of drought. There's quite a few that are in D2. And really, even this week, we had 8 more counties added to the list that are declared disaster with the USDA. So that brings the number up to 54 counties across Kansas declared as primary natural disaster areas, and the numerous contiguous counties also included in that. So, those are things widespread that can be used as evidence, but really for your own field, soil moisture probes and things like that is what RMA is also counts as evidence to that widespread drought conditions.
Right to it then, if prevent plant is claimed by the producer, they qualify, what kind of payment structure is arranged here for them?
That is really the key into economically if this should be done or not, because it's an interesting situation that we're looking at right now. As Lucas said, there's so many different dynamics besides the prevent plant decision, because we have obviously the war in Ukraine. We have very tight global supplies on corn, wheat, obviously, even though we're not looking at that here as a prevent plant, but the world really needs this crop right now. So that is really playing out in what our harvest prices could be this fall. But really what you're looking at now, if you take prevent plant, it is your crop insurance guarantee using the base price. And then for corn, 55% of that. So for an example, if you had a corn contract, your APH is 120 bushels per acre, you do 75% coverage. The base price this year was $5.90. That's a guarantee of $531 per acre. You would get 55% of that, which would be $292 per acre. One thing to recognize key in this decision, these base prices for these crop insurance contracts were the February average of the Chicago Board of Trade futures contract. For corn, that's the December futures contract. For grain sorghum, it's 99.6% of that corn contract. For soybeans, that is the February average of the November futures contract. So when you're looking at that February average, the war in Ukraine started on February 24th. So as those prices shot up, that was not captured very well in those starting projected prices for crop insurance. So as we're looking at things now, we don't have that crystal ball, but these futures contracts are running significantly higher than this. So for example, our corn and our grain sorghum are looking right now about $7.50. Soybeans higher, $15 or so. So using those prices, and obviously things can change by October, but by taking Prevent Plant now, your crop insurance contract will not be using those harvest prices. And that is really key in making this decision, because a failed crop might actually produce a bigger crop insurance payment than taking the Prevent Plant if these harvest prices do come in as high as they are right now.
We need to take a quick break, Robin and Lucas, and then we'll pick back up on this topic of whether or not to claim Prevent Plant within one's crop insurance coverage for 2022 because of drought conditions. Lucas Haag, Robin Reid, K-State Research and Extension with us. We'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. We are back now on Agriculture Today, and in the midst of a discussion about Prevent Plant for producers who are looking at dry conditions expected for this growing season in the midst of drought, and whether or not they should go ahead and seed that crop or claim that Prevent Plant option on their crop insurance. Robin Reid, agricultural economist, and Lucas Haag, crop production specialist, K-State Research and Extension, are with us. Robin, before we took a break there, you were walking through some numbers that producers need to compare, and that is the base price in their crop insurance policies for the respective crops compared to what may be the harvest prices that they're looking at and all the dynamics that will lead to those eventual numbers. There is, thankfully, a handy spreadsheet that producers can use to crank their own numbers through, right?
Yeah, so what I tried to do is make this fairly simplistic in comparing planting the crop versus taking Prevent Plant. And so that spreadsheet that you can find on Ag Manager along with this paper, you put in your own APH yield, your crop insurance guarantee level, and your Prevent Plant payment factor. I called it for corn 55%. You did have the option to buy up on Prevent Plant coverage when you purchase crop insurance. So that may be actually 60% if you bought up on Prevent Plant when we're talking about corn here. So putting that in, and then it will let you know what that Prevent Plant payment is for your specific situation, and then recognize there are going to be some weed control costs if you do take Prevent Plant. So taking that into consideration gives you a net return for the year by taking the Prevent Plant option. The other option is obviously planting that crop. So it has a budget in that spreadsheet to kind of walk you through what expenses are you going to have if you put that corn in the ground. Now, what we call a sunk cost is anything that you've done already that going forward, you can't undo. So if you have fertilizer out there, if you have chemical burned down, applied, those are kind of sunk costs. Some of that will help out in the future crop with some of that nitrogen in the soil, but basically recognizing going forward, what is the expected yield? When I did a default, I said, well, if it's this dry, maybe half of your APH. So just starting from there and then kind of playing around with that number and seeing how it affects the payments. But from there, what's your crop insurance payment going to be based on the harvest price? And then what's your anticipated crop income and your input costs, machinery, field operations, and harvesting costs of going ahead and carrying that crop to harvest. And so comparing the net return between those two scenarios really is helpful in deciding what option you should go with, either taking that prevent plant or going ahead and putting that crop in the ground, even though conditions are not ideal. So that is available. We've been talking about corn, but it is also available in the same spreadsheet for grain sorghum and for soybeans.
And again, as usual, you can find that at the agmanager.info website. As you note in the accompanying paper, though, Robin, there are so many individualized conditions and circumstances that producers need to think about. You mentioned the fertilizer rates, the sunk costs, but having hired employees under their wing, for instance, that's sort of tangible. These things have to be contemplated too, you say.
Absolutely. So, the easiest thing to do in a budget is look at what's the custom rates, because that's a really good proxy for what's it cost you to plant that crop and harvest that crop. But in reality, a lot of producers are doing these operations themselves. So they don't have, complete savings of, planting that crop or harvesting that crop, because they might have employees that they're paying no matter if that crop's in the ground or not, or running their own equipment. That equipment is going to depreciate and they got to make payments on it. And so it's not a complete savings, if they're not custom hiring these operations. So there's a lot of things to go into this decision, not just specifically straightforward economics of harvest price and base price, but those really do come into play just because of the unique scenario that we have in the world right now.
And the agronomics have to remain part of this. Lucas, bring you back in here. One would think about, if prevent plant is taken, what to do with that fallow ground there. Let it be summer fallow, let it be cover crop. You've been discussing these scenarios with producers?
Yes, there's a lot of pieces of that, Eric. And, and Robin mentioned the idea of sunk costs. And that's another situation where we got to, there's a little bit of a location thing into that. If we think about Western Kansas, we got that nitrogen down. Well, if we're dry enough that we're considering prevent plant, that also means we're probably dry enough, we're not having much loss of nitrogen. And so that's one thing, as producers are working through that spreadsheet, think about, out here, even if we've already put that nitrogen down for a corn or sorghum crop and we decide to prevent plant, I would expect the vast majority of that nitrogen to be available to a subsequent wheat crop. And so, how we treat that versus if you're further east in the state or if you're on sandy soils, situations where we know we might lose some of that nitrogen, we might want to make some adjustments in terms of how we're handling that expense in the spreadsheet. But yeah, so then, if we make that decision, same thing on herbicides. Like, well, we're going to have some herbicide expenses if we go ahead and plant the ground. But, if we're in a no-till system, we obviously have herbicide expenses to keep that ground as well managed fallow also. And so whether you're doing no-till or whether you're doing a reduced till type system, and maybe you believe that you can do tillage cheaper than what your herbicide cost would be, those are all considerations that, we need to actually, that a producer would have to tailor these numbers to his own operation.
If one, Lucas, were contemplating going ahead and taking prevent plant and then coming back on that acreage with winter wheat seeding this fall, a few things need to be thought about there, don't they? Perhaps herbicide carryover being one of them?
Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. Depending upon what herbicides they may have put down already for a row crop, we definitely would want to check those rotation intervals and make sure we're good on the label to go back to wheat without any expectation of injury. So, no, that's a really good point. The other thing is, from a field to field basis, looking at what's the situation of that field in terms of its residue cover. If we've got something that's getting pretty bare and thinking about, summer fallowing that again, if you don't have that residue there to cut down on evaporative losses, we're going to struggle to bank very much water. We got the potential for wind erosion. So again, even at a field by field level, there's some other factors that may enter into whether or not any given field is a good candidate for prevent plant.
Robin, a couple of final things here. What happens to the APH, actual production history, on one's insurance coverage if they take prevent plant this year?
Well, that is definitely one more item to consider because, if you do take prevent plant, that would not be shown up in your APH for future years. So, it would basically just not have a corn yield in there for 2022, and your guarantee would remain the same for 2023. If you do plant that crop and it fails or has a very low yield, then that yield will be in your APH history and rate yield for future guarantees, unless you use the yield exclusions or other provisions to adjust that APH. But, that is something to consider, just not dinging your APH history if you take that prevent plant option.
All this is fully detailed in the article at Ag Manager, but finishing out here, Robin, for the record, remind of those final planting dates associated with each of the crops as far as crop insurance coverage goes, so producers will remember those deadlines and adhere to them.
Yeah, so again, emphasizing, be in contact with your crop insurance agent throughout the planting period if you are considering prevent plant. But what you really have to do is 72 hours from the final planting date, if you are going to take prevent plant, you need to notify your crop insurance agent. You can plant the crop in the late planting period. Just recognize that your crop insurance is going to drop by 1% per day after that final planting date. And as I said earlier, with these higher harvest price potentials, that 1% could be a pretty significant number if this crop does not actually have a good yield by the time we get to harvest, and you're going to have a considerable, pretty hefty crop insurance payment. So yes, again, final planting dates for corn range from May 15th in southeast Kansas, May 25th for eastern and central crop reporting districts, and May 31st for our western third of the state. For grain sorghum, that's June 25th. And then for soybeans, final planting date, June 15th. In our northern counties, all the way down to June 30th in the southeast. But again, you can plant after these final planting dates in the late planting period. You still can do prevent plant in the late planting period, but every day that you drag your feet on that decision, it is a 1% reduction in your crop insurance contract if you decide to go ahead and plant that crop.
Very well. And do go to agmanager.info, find that spreadsheet that helps one work through this decision and crunch all the numbers, and the accompanying article, Considerations for Taking Prevent Plant in 2022 Because of Drought Conditions. Covers the topic in full right there. agmanager.info. And Lucas, Robin, thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
Robin Reid, agricultural economist, and Lucas Haag, crop production specialist based in northwest Kansas, both with K-State Research and Extension. We'll return with more on this Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
I think farming or ranching is doing stuff, and maybe that is why I like it.
That's Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
I've always admired people who can build stuff. The other day, my daughter, Johanna, sent a photo over the phone of their Baltimore Oriole feeder with birds on it. It was a homemade construction, elegant and cheerful. Only one part, the dish, had been bought. The rest was pulled together and bent and shaped to create the feeder and was attached to their deck. Talk about making things. She is a fantastic quilter. Her husband can take a car apart and put it back together. Together, they built their home in New York when they lived there. Now, they live closer. On the deck, we have tables made by Wayne, her husband. Beautiful work. My wife, Anneke, knits, or used to, beautiful sweaters. I'm thankful that I, too, can build. I'm not the detail man, but when I look at the pole sheds I've built, admittedly with help, but I had the idea, I feel pride. Especially when equipment stands inside out of the weather. The horse corral we built next to it, and as part of it, we incorporated the heavy rock wall as back wall. When the gates were hung and they opened and closed smoothly, I felt good. Especially good was the feeling when the horses were corralled, and you could lean over the gate and look at them while the dogs lay close by in the shade. I think farming or ranching is doing stuff, and maybe that is why I like it. Long ago we built fences. It's hard work, but a good feeling when the wires are up and the line is straight, corner posts are deep into the ground, and the wires are taut. Over the years when we walking the fence, I enjoyed touching the wires. They were still taut. It gives pride in a job well done. The last few years, my oldest son Guido has walked the fence line. Last week, he finished the job for this season, and his wife went with him. It's a good walk. I had tasked myself to walk the boundary this year. I wanted to do it on my 90th birthday, but I didn't pull it off. It was the weather, and no one to walk with me at that time. I could just see it, me stumbling in the bottom of a steep draw without a cell phone, also with no dogs to tell where the old man was resting. Maybe I'll walk the fence line later. This week the cows are getting on the grass. Guido said there was good grass where we burned. When not burned, the new grass was slow coming. I'm extremely thankful that the rain has come. Walking the fence line, you'll pass the old home site where we have the camping and the picnic spot. That's where the picnic table stands, which I built from old, solid lumber. I'll take a rest and sit for a while. I'll look around and reminisce. That is where the old house once stood. Only the basement built of fieldstone remains. It looks like they built it themselves long ago. For me, is that force, that strength, which makes a country our country.
Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That's our time for today. As always, thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.